My grandfather served in the Vietnam War. I was always fascinated about his time in the service, but my mother had instructed me not to ask him about it from a young age, and I never did. But he would bring up little bits and pieces now and then. It wasn't often, though. My grandfather was a kind yet strict man. My grandma told me that he was very laid back and calm before the war, but afterwards he came back the old, hardened man that I knew growing up. I distinctly remember once playing with my military toys as a kid, and he just walked in and shook his head, saying, "It wasn't like that, kid." What I'm saying is that although I love my grandfather, he can be a cold man sometimes. I don't blame him. I didn't see the horrors that he saw. Time had taken its toll on my grandfather, though, and all his years of smoking have caught up with him. For the last few weeks, he's been in a hospital on his deathbed. The cancer's spread from his lungs to the rest of his body. I've been spending a lot of time beside his bed, just keeping him company or watching TV with him. Recently, likely because he knows that his time is coming sooner rather than later, he's been telling stories. Some have been about his childhood, raising my mother, old school friends, while others, and more importantly, have been about his time in Vietnam. The stories started off small, with him first telling me about some of his friends that he served with and things of that nature. As time went on, though, he opened up more and more. He started telling me about the things he did, the things he saw. He told me about the napalm attacks in the jungle, how he and his squad were right on the outside of a clear zone when it hit. They watched as the planes dropped it, setting ablaze the jungle and in turn, everyone inside. He said he heard the screams of those burning alive, gut-wrenching, horrible screams of pure agony. "Sounded like hell in our world," he said before stating, "I suppose it was." As if the sounds weren't enough, one of the victims came running out of the inferno, like a ball of fire with arms and legs, my grandfather told me. He said after a few dozen yards, he just fell on the ground screaming. My grandfather and a war friend of his walked over to the burning body to see it struggling to extinguish the flames on the ground. My grandfather looked away from my eyes at that part of the story. "It was just a fucking kid," he sighed. "Fucking kid with his flesh melting off his damn bones." He took a deep breath. "We couldn't just leave him out there like that, so I took my gun and put the poor bastard out of his misery." I knew these stories were causing him distress, bringing back memories that he had probably tried to forget for years. I told him that he didn't have to talk about any of this if he didn't want to, but he insisted. Following up with, "That wasn't even the worst thing I saw." It was the middle of the day. My grandfather and his squad were walking through the jungle. He said that they were doing their usual thing when his sergeant put up his hand for all of them to stop and stay quiet. "This happens sometimes," he said. "Sergeant would think he heard something and we'd all have to shut up. Saved our lives a few times, I suppose. Other times." He trailed off. They all sat and listened for a minute, when my grandfather noticed something. Nothing in the jungle was making a sound. No wildlife, no bugs, not even the swaying of leaves in the wind, nothing. He tightened his grip on his gun as he looked around, his eyes darting from treetop to the ground, searching for the enemy. It was then that he noticed something. The jungle was always fucking hot. You were never not sweating your ass off, even if you were just standing there, he said. But then, for that one time, it was cold. Ice cold. In just a second, I could see my breath fog up as it left my mouth. My grandpa turned to see his squad mates all looking around in amazement as well, as they all watched the wisps of their breath fog up in the air. They sat there, frozen in shock at what they were witnessing, when a fellow squad mate right behind him jerked to look around all of a sudden, clearly startled by something he heard in the jungle. And Tharp and I were buddies. We'd seen a lot of shit together in the war, so I knew he was usually level-headed even under fire, my grandpa clarified. But we could see from the look on his face that whatever he had heard had spooked him real bad. Right then, out of nowhere, he started calling out to the jungle, "Jill!" Grandpa said he had instantly clapped his hand over Tharp's mouth to shut him up. The soldier struggled against my grandpa and tried to break free as the rest of his squad got ready for the inevitable firefight that was sure to come after Tharp had given up their location by yelling. "Wait!" I interrupted my grandfather's tale. Was Jill another soldier? No. Jill was Tharp's girl back home, Grandpa said coldly. Even with my hand over his mouth, he kept trying to call for Jill over and over again. I kept whispering to him, "Tharp, you gotta calm down, Jill's not here. You're gonna get us all killed," but he just kept struggling. That's when another one called out. This time for his mom. No one was there to stop the other soldier calling like my grandpa had Tharp, allowing the soldier to run straight into the jungle, calling out for his mother. Tharp was fighting to break free, tears now rolling down his eyes as he struggled. My grandpa held his ground, though, doing his best to keep the soldier pinned. However, my grandpa was distracted as another soldier ran into the jungle, calling after someone they knew from home, someone who had no right to be in the jungles of Vietnam. Tharp made use of the diversion to get out his knife and stab my grandfather in the leg. I screamed as Tharp broke free and ran out into the jungle, calling out for Jill. One by one, the squad broke down and ran out into the jungle, all while the temperature seemed to be getting colder and colder. This whole time, soldiers were running into the jungle for someone they heard calling for them. My grandfather heard nothing, nor did seemingly any of the other men until they ran out screaming after a loved one. Eventually, there was only my grandpa and one other soldier, back to back, guns drawn and at the ready, as their breath fogged up the now cold jungle air. After a moment of silence, the screams of their rogue squad mates filled the jungle air all around them. Some sounded far away, while others seemed to be coming from right behind them. They eventually sounded even more piercing, given the silence that had momentarily fallen upon the area. Then, it happened to my grandfather. "Your grandma." I heard her voice, like she was standing right next to me, whispering into my left ear. His lip was quivering. I turned to look at her when I saw this thing through the trees. It wasn't close to me like it sounded, no. It was a good 30 feet or so back from the clearing. My grandfather paused, so I asked him, "What was it?" He let out a laugh. "Fuck if I know. Sure as hell wasn't Charlie, that's for damn sure. It looked... He took pause for a moment, seeming to wonder how he would go about describing it before ultimately saying, "It looked like how radio static sounds. Like I couldn't make out what I was seeing because my eyes were getting a bad signal. I could tell it was big though. Real fucking big. Looked like a shadow too," he added. "I could see that it was ripping one of our guys apart, sending the camo legs of one of my squad mates hurtling into the jungle. I didn't see what he did to the top half of the guy. I don't know if the other guys that ran toward the thing had seen it, or if they just heard the voice and ran in that direction in a panic, but for whatever reason, I didn't go after it. I was mortified. I grabbed the guy behind me and started dragging him back in the general direction of our base. He figured out what I saw and screamed at me. Said he wasn't gonna leave his other soldiers behind." Grandpa paused and reached over his nightstand to grab a glass of water with a trembling hand. He took a long drink before continuing. "I told him it was a suicide mission. That he hadn't seen that thing in the trees and what it could do to him, but he didn't care. He said we left no man behind and ran back into the trees towards the screams of our friends. I kept making my way back to base. Wasn't long until I heard gunshots, then screaming, then nothing." I sat in silence as my mind digested my grandfather's story. "So what happened next?" I asked. "I made it back to base. Tried telling my supervisors what happened, but they figured I was just some scared kid who just seen his squad massacred in front of him. And they weren't wrong about that, but I know it wasn't men or bullets that killed them. I know what the fuck I saw." My grandfather passed away about 2 weeks after he told me that story. And truth be told, I don't know what to think of it. I figured I'd share it here, let you make your own assumptions, but my grandpa was never delusional, even near the end. And although it sounds impossible, I saw the terror in his eyes as he talked about that thing. There was no way that anyone would have been able to be that afraid of something that didn't happen.